dust, and a promise. The train ground to a halt, ejecting Sarah and Lily onto the Harmony Creek platform. Miniature cyclones whipped across the parched earth, the swirling particles abrading Sarah's eyes and adding a ruddy tinge to Lily's cheeks. The air, devoid of moisture, offered a sharp contrast to the verdant, humid hills Sarah had left behind. Even the sun seemed to possess a malevolent intensity. Resituating Lily, feeling her comforting weight, Sarah regarded the minuscule station, its clapboard siding flaking away like old sunburn. A solitary bench broiled under the sun's glare. Harmony Creek. The name mocked the desolation. Sarah drew in a steadying breath, a silent act of fortitude. This was the precipice of something new, hopefully a beginning. She tugged at the strap of her threadbare carpet bag, its paltry contents seeming lighter than ever. Everything she owned, besides the babe in her arms, resided within. The station master, a weathered man sporting a walrus mustache and eyes that had absorbed too much dust, regarded her with a jaded curiosity. "Help you, ma'am," he croaked, his voice a low rasp. "I'm looking for Jedediah Miller," Sarah replied, a tremor in her voice. "He lives around here, doesn't he?" His gaze narrowed, taking in her worn boots and faded dress. "Jedediah? Last I saw him, he was headed south. Must have been 6 months ago, give or take." A cold dread washed over Sarah. "South? But he owns a farm here, doesn't he?" The station master sighed, the sound akin to a punctured bellows. "Owned, past tense. Bank foreclosed on him months back. Jedediah skipped town before they could properly hang him out to dry. Rumor has it he was in debt all over the county." The world seemed to list precariously. Sarah clutched Lily tighter, her knuckles straining white. 6 months. Jedediah had vanished half a year ago. All this way for naught. Do you know where he went?" she breathed, her voice barely audible. The man simply shook his head. "South's a vast territory, ma'am. Could be anywhere. Heard whispers about him chasing some fool's gold in the silver mines." Sarah stared at the dust-strewn street, the flimsy buildings blurring in the heat. The fragile bloom of hope, nurtured throughout the long journey, withered on the vine. This couldn't possibly be reality. Where was his farm located?" she managed to ask. The station master gestured with a knotted finger towards a rutted path leading away from the cluster of buildings. "Past Widow Jenkins' place. Can't miss it, though there's little left worth seeing." Sarah swallowed against the knot in her throat. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with unshed tears. She started walking, her boots stirring up clouds of fine dust. Lily shifted, emitting a soft, plaintive sound. "It's all right, little one," Sarah murmured, pressing a kiss to her daughter's soft hair. "Mama's got you." Each step felt heavier than the last. The sun blazed down with relentless force, the landscape offering no sanctuary, only stunted vegetation and arid fields. Finally, she saw it, a decaying farmhouse, its windows sealed with planks, its roof sagging like a defeated spine. The yard was a riot of weeds, the fence a skeletal ruin. Abandoned, forgotten. Sarah stumbled through the broken gate, her heart a leaden weight in her chest. This was it, the sanctuary she had envisioned, the haven for herself and Lily. But she only found dust and disappointment. Reaching the front door, her hand trembled as she lifted the latch. It swung inward with a protesting groan, revealing a dark, desolate space. The interior air was stagnant and thick with decay. Cobwebs hung like ghostly shrouds, and dust coated every surface. Clearly, nobody had crossed the threshold in a long time. She ventured inside, her eyes struggling to adjust to the dim light. The main room contained little more than a broken chair and an overturned table. A discarded rag doll lay forlornly in the corner. Despite the heat, a shiver traced its path down Sarah's spine. This was it, the end of the line. She sank to her knees, overwhelmed by despair. Lily began to wail, sensing her mother's distress. Sarah pulled her daughter close, rocking her gently. "Hush, little one," she whispered, her voice choked. "Mama's here. We'll be all right." But how could she make things all right? Penniless, homeless, without family. Only Lily. Her thoughts drifted back to the sterile hospital room, to Thomas's pallid face, his hand gripping hers with desperate strength. She recalled his shallow breaths, the frailness in his voice. "Sarah," he had rasped, his eyes filled with love and fear. Promise me you'll take care of Lily. Promise me you'll find Jedediah. He'll help you. He's family." She had promised, readily offering him what solace she could. It was his final request. But Jedediah was not here. He had left them adrift, alone. Tears flowed freely, mingling with the dust on Sarah's cheeks. Looking down at Lily's crimson, tear-streaked face, something within her shifted. The despair did not vanish, but became intertwined with a steely resolve. She had given Thomas her word. She would keep it, regardless of the obstacles. Jedediah may have failed them, but she would not fail Lily. She would find a way. She had no other choice. Sarah rose, her legs unsteady, but her purpose solid. She brushed the dust from her dress, her gaze taking in the desolate room. This wasn't the haven she craved, but it was shelter, for the moment. "Come on, Lily," she said, her voice firmer now. "Let's see what we can salvage here." The task ahead appeared Herculean, nearly insurmountable. But as Sarah emerged once more into the scorching sunlight, holding her daughter tight, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She wouldn't surrender. She owed it to Thomas, and more importantly, she owed it to Lily. She would find a way to survive, to flourish, even in this unforgiving place. She would wrest a future from the dust, a night under the stars. The setting sun cast long shadows across the dusty street as Sarah, cradling Lily, neared the Harmony Creek General Store. Above the entrance, a time-worn sign groaned, advertising provisions for people and animals. Hope flickered. Perhaps she'd find someone willing to lend assistance. Inside, the air was thick with the aromas of cured tobacco, tanned hide, and a hint of sweetness, perhaps from cooking molasses. A pot-bellied stove offered a meager haven of warmth, where two men occupied themselves with a checkerboard. The store owner, a gaunt man with a permanently creased brow, watched their game with ill-concealed ennui. Sarah's throat felt like sandpaper. "Excuse me," she croaked, her voice hoarse from travel. "I was hoping you might know of a room for rent, just for a night or two." His gaze, the color of washed-out jeans, swept over her travel-stained dress and the sleeping infant. "Lodging's a rare commodity these days," he drawled. "Mrs. Henderson's boarding house is bursting at the seams. And the hotel? Well, that's no sanctuary for a lone woman, especially encumbered with a babe." Sarah's spirits plummeted. "Are there any other possibilities?" she begged. "My resources are limited, but I can offer something." He merely shrugged. "Folks here mostly keep to themselves. Charity's a dry well in these hard times." He turned back to the checkers, dismissing her with a flick of his wrist. Panic began to prick at Sarah's resolve. She turned to the men by the stove. "Gentlemen, forgive my intrusion, but I'm in a predicament. My husband recently passed, and I sought assistance from my brother-in-law, only to find him gone. I simply need sanctuary for the night." One, his face a crinkled map of hard-won years, grunted. "Sorry, Mom. No space to spare. My own family's packed in like sardines." The other didn't even deign to acknowledge her. Sarah offered a quiet thanks and retreated, the weight of her desperation a palpable burden. As she pushed back outside, the bell above the door chimed with cruel irony. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving a violet-tinged sky sprinkled with nascent stars. She discovered a lee behind the store, the wooden wall offering a degree of shelter from the wind. The ground was hard and unforgiving, strewn with pebbles and withered stalks. Reaching into her satchel, she extracted the last of her bread. Stale and dry as dust, it was all she had. She broke off a small piece, moistening it with saliva, and offered it to Lily. The baby nursed on it contentedly, her wide blue eyes brimming with innocent trust. Watching her, Sarah felt a surge of maternal strength, a fierce protectiveness that caught in her throat. "We'll be all right, Lily Bug," she murmured, stroking the baby's downy hair. "I promise we will." She swallowed her own meager portion, the bread scratchy against her parched throat. Hunger pangs jabbed at her stomach, but she pushed them aside, focusing solely on Lily's needs. As the night deepened, a biting chill descended. The wind, a relentless predator, found every chink in Sarah's thin dress. She cocooned Lily tighter in her shawl, attempting to create a shared pocket of warmth. Shaking with cold, Sarah began to hum a lullaby her mother used to sing, her voice wavering slightly. The familiar tune, however imperfectly sung, seemed to comfort Lily, who snuggled closer, her small body radiating a precious warmth. The constellations wheeled above, indifferent to their plight. Sarah gazed upward, feeling utterly isolated and insignificant in the face of such immensity. Misgivings tightened their grip. Had she made a disastrous choice coming here? Was she resilient enough to navigate this adversity? Was she failing her late husband? A meteor slashed across the heavens, a brief spark of brilliance against the inky backdrop. Sarah closed her eyes, offering a silent entreaty. Not for herself, but for Lily. For safe harbor, for solace from the cold, for the prospect of a brighter future. The night crawled by, a marathon of cold and discomfort. Sarah couldn't risk sleep, fearful of unseen dangers lurking in the shadows. She huddled tighter, her body screaming in protest, her spirit on the verge of collapse. The vow she had made to Thomas, the unwavering love she held for Lily. These were her lifelines, the embers keeping her alive in the encroaching darkness. She refused to yield. She could not falter. Lily deserved better, and Sarah would fight for it until her last breath. Sheriff Brody's kindness. The first sliver of dawn, a bruised purple bleeding into gray, woke Sarah. Every muscle screamed in protest as she shifted, the cold having burrowed deep into her bones. Lily stirred against her, a soft, snuffling sound. Sarah held her tighter, offering what little warmth she had left. The air smelled of wood smoke and something metallic, acrid. A shadow fell across them. Sarah's heart leaped in her throat. She scrambled to her feet, shielding Lily instinctively. A tall man stood before her, his face etched with concern. He wore a worn leather jacket over a flannel shirt, and a star glinted dully on his chest. "Sheriff, ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Are you all right? And the little one?" Sarah swallowed, her mouth dry. She hadn't spoken to anyone with kindness in their voice since before Tom died. We're fine," she managed, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her lie. The sheriff's gaze swept over their makeshift shelter, the thin blanket, Sarah's chapped hands. He didn't look convinced. "You spent the night out here?" She nodded, shame burning her cheeks. We didn't have anywhere else to go." He frowned, the lines around his eyes deepening. "What's your name, ma'am?" "Sarah Miller," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "This is Lily." She nudged the baby forward slightly. "Sheriff Brody," he replied, extending a hand. Sarah hesitated, then shook it briefly, his grip firm but gentle. "What brings you to Harmony Creek, Mrs. Miller?" The question hung in the cold air. Sarah looked away, unable to meet his gaze. How could she explain the tangled mess her life had become? The accident, Tom's death, Ben's disappearance, the cold indifference of the townspeople. My husband, he was in an accident," she finally said, the words catching in her throat. "We were passing through. He didn't make it." Brody's expression softened. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Miller. Truly sorry." He paused, then asked, "Do you have family here? Anyone who can help?" Sarah shook her head. "No, just Lily." He studied her for a long moment, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and concern. "And your husband's family? Did he have any kin around these parts?" The question felt like a stone in Sarah's stomach. "He had a brother, Ben." She paused, unsure how much to reveal. "He's gone. Missing." Brody's brow furrowed. "Missing? When did he go missing?" "The night of the accident," Sarah said, her voice barely audible. "He went to get help, and he never came back." The sheriff's silence stretched out, heavy and thoughtful. Finally, he sighed. "Look, Mrs. Miller, you can't stay out here. It's too cold, especially for the little one. Let me see what I can do." He turned and walked towards the general store, disappearing inside. Sarah hugged Lily tighter, relief washing over her in a dizzying wave. Maybe, just maybe, things were about to get a little better. A few minutes later, Brody emerged from the store, his face grim. "Most folks are saying they don't have room," he said, confirming Sarah's suspicions about the town's hospitality. "But there's Mrs. Henderson. She runs a boarding house on the edge of town. It ain't fancy, but it's warm and dry." He scribbled something on a scrap of paper. "Here's the address. Tell her I sent you. She's got a soft spot for those in need." He looked at Lily, tucked securely in Sarah's arms. "Go on now, before the day gets away from you. And Mrs. Miller," he added, his voice firm, "if you need anything else, anything at all, you come see me. Understand?" Sarah nodded, tears stinging her eyes. "Thank you, Sheriff. Thank you so much." She clutched the piece of paper in her hand and, with Lily nestled against her chest, started walking towards the edge of town, a tiny spark of hope flickering in her heart. The boarding house might not be much, but it was a roof over their heads, a refuge from a cold. And for now, that was enough. Pennies and compassion. The boarding house offered a roof, but not sustenance. Brody had paid for the week, a kindness Sarah wouldn't forget, but after that, she was on her own. Lily needed milk, diapers, things Sarah couldn't conjure from thin air. The next morning, armed with a threadbare resume Sheriff Brody had helped her cobble together, Sarah walked the dusty streets of Harmony Creek. The diner, a greasy spoon smelling of stale coffee and regret, turned her down flat. No experience. The owner, a man with a permanent squint, had grumbled, not even bothering to look up from his newspaper. The general store, overflowing with canned goods and farm supplies, offered the same excuse. "Steady hands, that's what we need. Can't have a baby underfoot." Desperation gnawed at her. She returned to the boarding house, Lily gurgling contentedly in her arms, oblivious to their predicament. Staring at the worn floral wallpaper, an idea sparked. Back in Boston, before everything, she'd enjoyed crafting small, whimsical trinkets, little wooden birds painted in vibrant colors, miniature dream catchers woven with delicate thread. It was a hobby, a way to unwind. Now, it had to be a lifeline. That afternoon, armed with scraps of wood, bits of wire pilfered from a discarded fence, and a meager art supplies she'd managed to salvage from her ruined life, Sarah set up a makeshift stall in the town square. A faded quilt served as her display. The trinkets, though small, were meticulously crafted, each one a tiny explosion of color against the drab landscape. The townsfolk mostly ignored her. Some cast curious glances, others averted their eyes, as if acknowledging her presence would somehow implicate them in her misfortune. A few children, drawn by the bright colors, lingered, their noses pressed against the quilt. Their parents, however, quickly ushered them away. Hours passed. The sun beat down, turning the square into a shimmering oven. Sarah's throat was parched, her hope dwindling with each passing minute. She offered a small wooden bird to a little girl with pigtails, but the mother pulled her daughter away, muttering about taking handouts. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, a lone figure leaned against the weathered wall of the general store, watching her. Caleb Johnson. He wasn't staring, exactly, but his gaze kept drifting back to her, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. He'd seen her walking around town all day. He'd heard the whispers. He knew she was Brody's charity case, the widow with the baby. Caleb felt a familiar, not tighten in his chest. He knew what it was like to be an outsider, to be judged, to be pitted. He'd seen enough hardship in his life to recognize it in others. Yet, something held him back from approaching her. He hadn't spoken more than a few words to anyone in months. The ranch was his sanctuary, his escape from a world that had dealt him one too many blows. But the sight of her, sitting there in the fading light, her face etched with weariness, stirred something within him. It wasn't pity exactly. It was compassion, a feeling he hadn't allowed himself to experience in a long time. Sarah packed up her unsold trinkets, her heart heavy. As she turned to leave, she noticed Caleb. He pushed himself off the wall and walked towards her. Sarah braced herself for another rejection, Another dismissive glance. He stopped a few feet away, his eyes, the color of storm clouds, fixed on the ground. He shuffled his feet, his usual gruffness seeming amplified by an awkwardness she didn't expect. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a handful of coins, and held them out to her. "Here," he mumbled, his voice rough around the edges. "For the little one." Sarah stared at the pennies in his calloused hand, her throat tight with emotion. It wasn't much, but it was everything. It was an acknowledgement, a gesture of kindness in a world that had seemed determined to crush her. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Caleb didn't meet her gaze. He simply dropped the coins in her outstretched hand, turned, and walked away, disappearing into the gathering darkness. The smell of dust and horseflesh lingered in the air, a strange mix of the mundane and the miraculous. Sarah looked down at the pennies, each one a tiny spark of hope in the vast darkness. Lily stirred in her arms, and Sarah held her close, a fierce determination hardening her gaze. They would survive. They had to. The storm breaks. Fat raindrops, like flung stones, awakened Sarah. She'd been lost in a dream of Thomas, his lopsided grin, his tuneless humming while under the hood of his car. A harsh stab of grief pierced her, an ever-present ache. Lily cooed softly beside her. Sarah stroked the baby's soft head, finding a fleeting comfort in her smallness. The rain escalated into a furious assault against the cheap roof. A rumble of thunder shook the floor, jarring the window. Sarah stood and peered out. The sky was a canvas of bruised violet, bulging with potential. The wind clawed at the earth, contorting the bare trees around Harmony Creek into macabre sculptures. This was beyond rain. It was a tempest gathering its forces, ready to unleash hell. Minutes later, the full storm exploded. Rain hammered the boarding house, a torrential downpour. The wind screamed through cracks, a keening lament that chilled Sarah to the bone. A single drop plopped on her forehead, then another. She glanced upward. A widening stain darkened the ceiling directly above Lily's crib. Panic seized her. Snatching a tin pail from beside the door, she positioned it to catch the leak. It filled almost at once with murky water. More drips materialized, a scattered map of dampness spreading across the stained plaster. The room was fast becoming a sieve. She dragged Lily's crib to the only dry patch, near the far wall. The air was thick with must and the reek of damp rot. Uncaring, the storm roared on. A sharp crack echoed, followed by a grating sound. Sarah's breath hitched. Something had broken. Clutching Lily close in a threadbare blanket, she huddled against the wall, praying the roof wouldn't give way. Outside, the gale tore at the boarding house's edges, ripping off loose shingles and sending them cartwheeling into the inky black. The old building shuddered, its frame groaning under the relentless pressure. Miles away, Caleb Johnson, settled on his porch, watched the approaching storm with a granite face. He'd witnessed such deluges before, bred in the mountains and fed by the plains' fury. Livestock secured, his modest ranch house battened down, his gaze kept returning to the distant lights of Harmony Creek. He knew the dilapidated state of that boarding house. Ancient, neglected, it clung precariously to its foundations. The image of the young woman and her child, their faces marked by struggle, flashed in his memory. The growing storm consumed the lights of Harmony Creek behind a screen of water. The wind howled with demonic fervor, and lightning illuminated the world in brief, jagged strokes. Caleb watched, jaw tight, an internal war waging. A recluse, he preferred the company of his herd. Yet, he couldn't forget the woman's grateful eyes when he pressed a few coins into her hand. A certainty settled, cold and heavy, in his gut. That boarding house wouldn't survive this. And he knew, with the same certainty, that he couldn't stand idly by. He stood abruptly, grabbing his oilskins and hat, and headed for his truck. The wind nearly yanked the door off its hinges as he wrestled it open. He climbed in, started the engine, and slammed the truck into gear. Tires spun, then gripped, and he lurched forward, toward Harmony Creek and the storm's core. He muttered it was just common decency. He told himself he'd be unable to face himself otherwise. But deeper down, it was more than that. Something about the young woman, her quiet resilience, had stirred a long-dormant ember within him, a spark of compassion he believed extinguished years ago. That spark was now flaring, threatening to ignite. Shelter in the cabin. The boarding house groaned, a drawn-out death rattle as the storm clawed at its already weakened frame. Sarah huddled tighter around Lily, the baby's whimpers lost in the wind's howl. Then, a thundering knock. Not the frail rapping of Mrs. Gable, but something forceful, insistent. Fear coiled in Sarah's stomach. The door splintered inwards as Caleb Johnson shoved it open, rain plastering his dark hair to his forehead. "Get out. Now. This place is coming down." His voice was rough, urgent, brooking no argument. Sarah, momentarily stunned, clutched Lily tighter. Where are we supposed to go?" "My cabin. It's not much, but it's standing." He didn't wait for an answer, scooping up a tattered blanket from the floor and wrapping it around Sarah and the baby. "Come on." He practically dragged her through the raging storm, the wind whipping at them like a physical assault. Lily cried, her small body trembling. Sarah stumbled, Caleb's grip firm on her arm, pulling her forward. The boarding house receded into the rain-blurred darkness, its demise seemingly imminent. The journey felt endless, a brutal fight against the elements. Finally, a small, dark shape loomed out of the downpour, a log cabin, weathered and worn, but undeniably solid. Caleb pushed open the heavy wooden door, ushering them inside. The air within was damp and musty, thick with the scent of mildew and disuse. One small window, covered in grime, offered a sliver of gray light. A single, iron-framed bed stood against one wall, its mattress thin and stained. A cold fireplace dominated the opposite wall, and a crude table and 2 chairs occupied the center of the room. It was Spartan, bordering on derelict, but compared to the imminent collapse they had escaped, it felt like a palace. Sarah looked around, her heart sinking. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "But it's uninhabitable." Caleb shrugged, his face unreadable in the dim light. "It's got a roof. That's more than you had 5 minutes ago." He crossed to the fireplace and began laying kindling. "I haven't been here in a while. Needs work." As Caleb coaxed a reluctant flame to life, Sarah took stock. Lily, thankfully, had fallen asleep, exhausted by the ordeal. Gently, Sarah laid her on the bed, using the blanket as a makeshift cushion. The cabin was freezing. More than just uninhabitable, it was dangerous for a baby. "I can help," she offered, her voice stronger now, resolve hardening her gaze. "We can fix it. Together." Caleb glanced at her, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "Don't get your hopes up. It's a long road." The next few days blurred into a rhythm of shared hardship. Caleb, surprisingly, proved to be a man of action. He cleared debris from the yard, patched holes in the roof with scavenged wood and tar, and chopped firewood with relentless energy. Sarah, despite her weariness, cleaned relentlessly. She scrubbed the grime from the window, letting in precious light. She swept the dirt floor and aired the musty blankets in a brief respite from the rain. They spoke little. Caleb was a man of few words, and Sarah, still wary, hesitant to reveal too much. But their shared labor fostered a fragile connection. He showed her how to bank the fire to keep it burning through the night. She showed him how to mend a tear in his worn shirt with surprisingly deft fingers. One evening, as Sarah nursed Lily by the fire, Caleb watched them, his expression softening almost imperceptibly. The firelight danced on Lily's face, highlighting her delicate features. "She's strong," he said, his voice rough. "Like her mother." Sarah met his gaze, a question in her eyes. He looked away, towards the flames. The cabin remained cold, drafty, and far from comfortable. But it was shelter, and within its rough-hewn walls, something else was slowly taking root. A grudging respect, a shared purpose, and perhaps a fragile seed of hope. The storm outside still raged, but within the cabin, a different kind of storm was beginning to subside, revealing the possibility of a calmer, if uncertain, future. A generous offer. The dust hadn't settled from the storm when a different kind of disruption arrived at Caleb's door. Not the howling wind and driving rain, but the measured approach of a polished buggy drawn by two perfectly matched bays. The man who stepped down was all crisp linen and condescending appraisal, a stark contrast to the cabin's weathered wood and overgrown yard. "Mr. Johnson, I presume?" The man's voice was smooth as oiled leather, but his eyes held a flinty edge. He offered a gloved hand, which Caleb ignored. "That depends. Who's asking?" Caleb leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, a silent challenge in his stance. The man, unfazed, withdrew his hand. "Name's Thornton, Samuel Thornton. I own the land bordering yours to the south." He gestured vaguely towards the distant fields, a gesture that encompassed more acreage than Caleb had ever imagined owning. "I've been meaning to call on you." Sarah, who had been tending the small vegetable patch Caleb had cleared, straightened up, wiping her brow with the back of her hand. Lily, nestled in a sling against her chest, stirred but remained asleep. Sarah's eyes darted between the two men, sensing the shift in atmosphere. "What do you want, Thornton?" Caleb's tone was blunt, bordering on rude, but Sarah understood it was a shield. A protection against the inevitable disappointment life seemed determined to deliver. Thornton's smile didn't quite reach his eyes. Straight to the point. "I appreciate that. I'm looking to expand my holdings. Johnson, your land sits right in the middle of my ambitions. I'm prepared to make you a very generous offer." He pulled a folded document from his coat pocket, the crisp rustle echoing in the sudden silence. Caleb didn't reach for it. "My land ain't for sale. Everything's for sale, Johnson. It's just a matter of price. This place, it's not exactly thriving. I imagine the storm didn't help matters. The sum I'm offering would set you up nicely. Enough to start fresh, somewhere less challenging." Thornton's gaze flickered towards Sarah, then back to Caleb, a knowing glint in his eyes. Sarah felt a flush creep up her neck. She didn't want to be the subject of this transaction. She wanted to disappear, to blend into the rough-hewn walls of the cabin and become invisible. Caleb's jaw tightened. "Get off my land, Thornton." Thornton remained unperturbed. "Think about it, Johnson. A new life. No more scraping by. A real future for your family." He emphasized the last word slightly, a subtle jab that hit its mark. He placed the document on the small table near the door. "The offer stands. I'll be back in a week." He turned and strode back to his buggy, the bays eager to leave the unkempt surroundings behind. The sound of the buggy receding faded into the afternoon breeze, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. Caleb stood frozen, staring at the document on the table as if it were a venomous snake. Sarah cautiously approached. "Caleb, maybe we should look at it." He whirled around, his eyes dark. "No, we don't need his charity." "It's not charity," Sarah countered softly. "It's business. And maybe it's an opportunity." Caleb ran a hand through his hair, his frustration palpable. He looked at Sarah, at the lines of weariness etched around her eyes, at Lily sleeping peacefully against her chest, oblivious to the turmoil swirling around them. He thought of the leaking roof, the dwindling supplies, the endless cycle of hard labor that barely kept them afloat. And he thought of what that money could do for them, for her. That night, after Sarah and Lily were asleep, Caleb lit a single lamp and unfolded the document. The sum Thornton offered was substantial, more money than Caleb had ever seen in his life. Enough to buy a decent piece of land, build a proper house, provide Sarah and Lily with the security they deserved. But it would mean leaving the land his father had worked, the land that held his memories, the land that was for better or worse his identity. And it would mean admitting defeat, admitting that he couldn't make it work, that he wasn't strong enough to overcome the obstacles in his path. He stared into the flickering lamplight, wrestling with the decision. Thornton's offer was a lifeline, a way out of the desperate situation they were in, but it came at a price that might be more than he was willing to pay. More than money. The slam of the truck door vibrated through the farmhouse, sending a tremor up Sarah's spine as she rinsed breakfast dishes. Lily, perched on a stool, pretending to stir imaginary batter, giggled. Sarah hushed her, a knot tightening in her stomach. That had been Mr. Thornton's truck. What was he still doing here? She'd caught snippets of their conversation earlier, enough to understand the gist. Land. Money. Caleb's name spoken with a predatory gleam. Sarah hadn't wanted to intrude, hadn't wanted to know, really. Ignorance felt safer than facing the potential disruption of their fragile peace. But the lingering presence, the heavy silence that had fallen over the yard, drew her in like a moth to a flickering flame. She wiped her hands on her apron and edged towards the back door, cracking it open just enough to peek out. Thornton stood by his truck, his face florid, gesturing emphatically. Caleb stood rigid, his back to the house, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. The wind carried snatches of their words. Think about it, Caleb. It's more than you'll ever make scratching at this dirt. Enough to set you up for life. Thornton's voice dripped with condescension. Caleb's reply was a low rumble, inaudible from her vantage point. Thornton chuckled, a harsh, unpleasant sound. Sentimentality won't put food on the table, son. And that little girl of yours deserves better than this hardship. The word struck Sarah like a physical blow. She flinched, her grip tightening on the doorframe. He knew about Lily. He was using her. Shame washed over Sarah, hot and stinging. She'd brought this upon them, this threat to Caleb's home, to their whatever it was they were building here. She pushed the door open wider, stepping onto the porch. The creak of the weathered would alerted them. Both men turned. Thornton's smile was oily, his eyes sliding over her with his assessing gaze that made her skin crawl. Caleb's expression was unreadable, a mask of granite. Sarah, Caleb said, his voice flat. Didn't hear you come out. I was just checking on Lily. She avoided his eyes, focusing on a loose thread on her apron. Well, I was just leaving, Thornton said, his tone oozing false charm. Nice seeing you again, Mrs. Miller. Think about what I said, Caleb. He climbed into his truck, the engine roaring to life, and sped away, leaving a cloud of dust hanging in the air. Silence descended, thick and heavy. Sarah braced herself, expecting Caleb to be angry, resentful. Instead, he just stood there, his gaze fixed on the receding dust cloud. He offered you a lot of money, didn't he? She asked softly, breaking the silence. Caleb finally turned to face her, his eyes shadowed. Enough. Enough to leave? The question hung between them, fragile as a spider's web. He didn't answer immediately. He looked around the farm, at the dilapidated barn, the overgrown fields, the porch where Lily was now cautiously peeking out from behind the screen door. It's just land, Sarah. Dirt and wood. But it's your land, she countered, her voice barely a whisper. Your family's. Family. He trailed off, the words sounding hollow. Sarah took a step closer, her heart aching for him. Caleb, you have to do what's right for you. For your future. Don't let us hold you back. If this is what you want, what you need, you should take it. He stared at her, his eyes searching hers. What I need? Yes, she insisted, forcing herself to meet his gaze. Think of the possibilities. You could start over. Build something new. Somewhere else. Somewhere better. Caleb remained silent for a long moment, then shook his head slowly. You don't understand. He walked towards her, closing the distance between them. His nearness sent a shiver through her, a confusing mix of fear and longing. He reached out, his calloused hand gently cupping her cheek. This isn't just about the land, Sarah. It's about... He hesitated, his thumb tracing the curve of her jaw. It's about you. And Lily. He looked at the screen door where Lily stood watching them, her small hand reaching out to touch the mesh. He looked back at Sarah. I thought I was alone here. I was just existing. Now, he swallowed hard, his voice rough with emotion. Now I have something worth fighting for. Something money can't buy. He dropped his hand, stepping back as if suddenly aware of his boldness. I'm not selling, he said, his voice firm, resolute. This is my home, and you both are my family. A home under the stars. The silence following Caleb's refusal was a palpable weight, eclipsing even the familiar piney fragrance. Thornton's face, once a mask of charming avarice, now contorted into something vile. You'll rue this day, Johnson, Take it from me. You're spurning an opportunity folks would butcher their own kin for around here. Caleb remained unyielding, his gaze steady. The matter is settled. A harsh snort erupted from Thornton. Fine, sweet yourself. Don't come whimpering when that brood of yours sucks you dry. He punctuated the moment with a gob of spit on the porch before pivoting towards his gleaming truck. The engine roared, scattering gravel in its wake as he peeled out. Sarah, transfixed just inside the doorway, Lily clutched tight, finally released a long-held breath. The tautness dissolved from her, leaving her drained. Caleb turned toward her, his features softening with concern. He saw the lingering fear in her eyes, the vulnerability she usually guarded so fiercely. He moved closer, extending a hand. Not to touch, not yet, but as a gesture of comfort. He won't trouble you again, Sarah. I won't permit it. She eyed his hand, weathered and strong, the hand of a farmer, a craftsman, and she suspected, a capable fighter. Yet, it was also the hand that had offered warmth, that had cradled Lily with unexpected tenderness. Her gaze lifted to meet his. He seemed utterly certain you'd accept. Caleb shook his head. He's mistaken. He views land as mere property, a ledger entry. I see it as belonging, as heritage. He paused, inhaling deeply. And now, I see you and Lily as part of that inheritance. The words hung delicately, resonating with untold promise. A nervous flutter seized Sarah's heart, like a caged bird frantic for release. She yearned to believe him, to place her trust in the sincerity blazing in his gaze. But years of disappointment had erected a fortress around her heart, one she was reluctant to dismantle. Caleb recognized her hesitancy, the silent struggle playing out within her. He knew he couldn't force belief, but he could demonstrate it. He could prove his words carried weight. Lowering his hand, he turned instead to Lily, who observed them with wide, innocent curiosity. He knelt, meeting her at eye level. Hey, little sprout, he greeted softly, a genuine smile lighting his face. How about we gather some wildflowers for your mama? Lily's face bloomed. Flowers, she chirped, reaching for Caleb's hand. He chuckled, enfolding her small hand in his larger one. All right then, let's see what treasures we can unearth. He glanced back at Sarah, his eyes conveying unspoken depths. We'll be right back. Sarah watched them stroll toward the meadow, Lily skipping happily beside Caleb, her tiny hand secure in his. The scene was a balm, soothing the last vestiges of apprehension. Perhaps, just perhaps, she could allow herself to hope. Later, under a velvet evening sky, the dishes done and Lily tucked in, Sarah and Caleb settled onto the porch swing, the rhythmic creak of its chains a gentle counterpoint to the chorus of crickets. The heavens stretched out, an obsidian canvas sprinkled with countless glittering stars. The Milky Way arced across the sky, a celestial river. It's breathtaking, Sarah breathed, her gaze lost in the cosmos. It is, Caleb concurred, his eyes fixed on her. The soft porch light illuminated her features, accentuating the gentle curve of her cheek, the subtle lines fanning out from her eyes, a testament to hardship, yet also resilience. He drew a deep breath, summoning his courage. Sarah, he began, his voice thick with emotion. I know our time together has been short, but these past weeks, having you here, it's transformed everything. You've breathed life back into this place. You've resurrected me. He hesitated, searching for the precise words. What I'm trying to articulate is, I cherish you, Sarah, more deeply than I ever conceived. And I feel the same about Lily. She's like the daughter I never dared dream of. He reached for her hand, his touch tentative, questioning. I know you've known pain, Sarah. I know you harbor fears. And I won't presume to understand the burdens you carry. But I promise you, if you grant me the chance, I'll dedicate myself to safeguarding you and Lily, to building a fulfilling life here, a secure life, a joyful life. He met her gaze, his own filled with unwavering sincerity. I'm not offering you a fortune, Sarah. I'm offering you my heart. I'm offering you belonging. A sanctuary under the stars. Sarah's breath hitched. Tears welled, blurring her vision. She gazed at Caleb, the man who had sheltered her from the tempest, the man who had welcomed her and Lily into his sanctuary, the man now bestowing his very soul. A realization dawned. Harmony Creek wasn't merely a location. It was an opportunity to recover, to rebuild, to embrace love once more. And Caleb wasn't just a taciturn loner. He was a guardian, a provider, a man of unshakable honor. He embodied everything she had ever craved. She reached out, her fingers interlacing with his. "Caleb," she murmured, her voice thick with suppressed emotion. I think I'm falling in love with you." He squeezed her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. "Then fall, Sarah, fall without reservation. Because I'm already there, waiting to catch you."